Ladies and gentlemen, today we gather to remember one of the most significant moments in modern history, the Nuremberg Trial. Held from 1945 to 1946, this trial was a turning point in international justice. It was the first time that world leaders were held accountable for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The Nuremberg Trial set a precedent for future international law and justice. The Nuremberg Trial was the first time in history that leaders of a defeated nation were held accountable for war crimes in a formal international court. Before this, acts of war, including atrocities committed by military forces, were often dealt with through political agreements, executions, or revenge rather than legal trials. However, the immense scale of destruction caused by World War II, particularly the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, forced the global community to rethink justice. The trial was organized by the Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, as part of their effort to ensure that Nazi leaders could not escape accountability. These nations recognized that merely punishing Germany as a whole would not be enough. Individual leaders who had orchestrated and carried out crimes needed to face justice. To achieve this, the Allies established the International Military Tribunal, IMD, a legal body that would operate under international law. This was a groundbreaking decision because it meant that war crimes and crimes against humanity were being formally addressed on a global scale for the first time. Unlike past conflicts, where victors often executed or imprisoned their enemies without legal proceedings, the Nuremberg Trial introduced the concept of a fair trial, even for those accused of the most heinous crimes. The trial also set a precedent for future war crimes tribunals. Before Nuremberg, there was no established international framework to prosecute individuals for acts of genocide, crimes against humanity, or aggressive war. The creation of the IMD showed that war criminals could be tried not just by the nations they had wronged, but by an international community united under a common cause: justice. Furthermore, the trial demonstrated the importance of evidence-based prosecution. Unlike previous instances of post-war justice, which often relied on battlefield retribution or vague accusations, the Nuremberg trial was built on a mountain of evidence, including official Nazi documents, eyewitness testimonies, and physical proof of the atrocities. The meticulous collection and presentation of evidence ensured that the convictions were based on facts rather than mere political motivations. By conducting the first international war crimes trial, the world took a crucial step toward creating a legal framework that would later evolve into institutions such as the International Criminal Court, ICC, and other war crimes tribunals. The legacy of Nuremberg continues to shape global justice systems, influencing how the world deals with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide even today. The decision to hold the trial in Nuremberg, Germany, was both practical and symbolic. On a practical level, Nuremberg was one of the few cities in Germany that still had an intact courthouse and prison facility after the destruction of World War II. The Palace of Justice, a large judicial complex in the city, had survived the Allied bombings and was spacious enough to accommodate the tribunal, legal teams, journalists, and international observers. Additionally, it had an attached prison where the accused Nazi leaders could be securely held throughout the trial. However, the choice of Nuremberg was not just about logistics, it carried deep symbolic meaning. Before the war, Nuremberg had been a significant city for the Nazi regime. It was the site of the infamous Nuremberg rallies, massive propaganda events where Adolf Hitler and other Nazi leaders gathered thousands of supporters to spread their ideology. These rallies played a key role in glorifying the Nazi movement and solidifying Hitler's grip on power. By holding the trial in the same city, the Allies transformed Nuremberg from a symbol of Nazi strength into a symbol of justice and accountability. Nuremberg was also where the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, racial laws that stripped Jewish people of their rights and laid the foundation for the Holocaust. By conducting the trial in the same city where these oppressive laws were enacted, the Allies sent a powerful message. The Nazi regime would be judged in the very place where its policies of hatred and genocide were officially sanctioned. The trial itself began on November 20th, 1945, and lasted for nearly a year, concluding on October 1st, 1946. It was an unprecedented legal event, as it brought together four major Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, to collectively prosecute the highest-ranking Nazi officials. This level of international cooperation was remarkable, considering that these nations had different legal traditions, political ideologies, and even rivalries that would later emerge in the Cold War. Despite these differences, they worked together to establish the International Military Tribunal, IMD, ensuring that justice was delivered fairly and transparently. The courtroom inside the Palace of Justice became the stage for one of the most significant legal proceedings in history. High-profile Nazi leaders, including Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, sat in the defendant's dock as they faced charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. The world watched as the trial unfolded, with news reports and radio broadcasts bringing the proceedings to a global audience. Never before had an entire regime's top leaders been held accountable in such a comprehensive and public manner. By choosing Nuremberg as the location for the trial, the Allies not only ensured a functional legal process, but also reshaped the city's legacy. What had once been a stronghold of Nazi ideology was transformed into the birthplace of modern international justice, setting the stage for future war crimes tribunals and legal frameworks aimed at preventing similar atrocities. The Nuremberg trial was historic not just because it was the first international war crimes tribunal, but also because it targeted the highest-ranking Nazi officials responsible for orchestrating the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. 24 of the most powerful Nazi leaders were charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. These individuals were not ordinary soldiers following orders. They were the architects of Nazi policies that led to genocide, aggression, and destruction across Europe. Among these 24 defendants were some of the most infamous figures of the Nazi regime. Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's closest confidants and the head of the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, was the most senior Nazi official on trial. As Hitler's designated successor for a time, Göring played a crucial role in both military aggression and the Holocaust, overseeing the early persecution of Jews and the establishment of concentration camps. Another key figure was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, who had mysteriously flown to Scotland in 1941 in an apparent attempt to negotiate peace with Britain. Although he had been sidelined in the later years of the war, his early role in shaping Nazi policies made him a significant defendant. The list of accused also included Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, who played a central role in securing alliances for Germany, including the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union. His diplomacy helped facilitate Hitler's aggressive expansion into Europe, leading directly to the outbreak of World War II. Other prominent names included Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the German military's high command, who authorized brutal military strategies, and Alfred Jodl, another top military planner involved in executing Nazi war policies. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, was charged for his role in overseeing the horrific treatment of Polish citizens and the extermination of Jews in the region. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a high-ranking SS officer, was held responsible for the operational aspects of concentration camps and mass killings. Each of these men had held positions of immense power, making key decisions that led to the deaths of millions. Their influence extended across military, political, and economic spheres, demonstrating how the Nazi war machine functioned at multiple levels. The trial marked an unprecedented effort to hold individuals accountable for their actions, rather than placing collective blame on an entire nation. Before Nuremberg, wars often ended with the execution or exile of political leaders without formal trials. However, this time, the world demanded legal proceedings based on evidence and due process. Notably, 3 of the original 24 defendants were not sentenced at the conclusion of the trial. Robert Ley, a high-ranking Nazi labor leader, committed suicide before the trial began. Gustav Krupp, the wealthy industrialist who had supported Hitler's war efforts, was deemed too ill to stand trial. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, was tried in absentia as he had disappeared during the final days of the war. His death was confirmed years later. The trial of these 24 men sent a powerful message. No matter how powerful or influential a person may be, they can and will be held accountable for their actions. These were not mere pawns in the Nazi regime, but its key architects, responsible for some of the worst crimes in human history. One of the most groundbreaking aspects of the Nuremberg trial was the introduction of the charge of crimes against humanity. Before this trial, war crimes were typically limited to violations of traditional military conduct, such as mistreating prisoners of war or using prohibited weapons. However, the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany were on an entirely different scale. The world had never witnessed crimes of such systematic cruelty, mass extermination, and racial persecution. As a result, the legal framework had to be expanded to hold individuals accountable for crimes that went beyond conventional warfare. The prosecution at Nuremberg formally charged the Nazi leaders with 4 major crimes. Crimes against peace, planning and waging aggressive wars. War crimes, violations of the rules of war, including the mistreatment of prisoners and civilians. The crimes against humanity, the persecution, enslavement, and extermination of entire groups of people. Conspiracy to commit these crimes, planning and executing these crimes in coordination with others. Among these, crimes against humanity was the most significant legal innovation. This charge specifically addressed the Nazis' genocide, ethnic cleansing, and systematic extermination of millions of innocent people, most notably the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. The inclusion of this charge ensured that the world recognized these acts as unique crimes that could never be justified under the guise of war. Defining crimes against humanity. The crimes against humanity were defined as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against civilian populations before or during the war, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds in execution of or in connection with any crime within the jurisdiction of the tribunal. This definition covered mass killings, forced labor, medical experiments on prisoners, starvation policies, and the persecution of Jews, Romani people, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. For the first time in legal history, the systematic killing of civilians, even by a government within its own borders, was recognized as a crime under international law. Evidence of crimes against humanity. During the trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of the Nazis' crimes, using official Nazi documents, survivor testimonies, and even footage from liberated concentration camps. One of the most impactful moments in the trial was the showing of films documenting the Holocaust, including the liberation of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. The footage of emaciated prisoners, mass graves, and gas chambers left no room for denial. Witnesses, including Holocaust survivors, gave harrowing accounts of their suffering. They spoke of the brutality of SS guards, forced medical experiments, starvation, and the systematic execution of entire families. The testimony of Dr. Rudolf Haas, the commandant of Auschwitz, was particularly damning. He admitted under oath that over 1 million people were murdered in the camp's gas chambers. Implications for future justice. By including crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg trial, the tribunal established a legal foundation for prosecuting future genocides and human rights violations. This charge later influenced international law, leading to the Genocide Convention, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and the establishment of the International Criminal Court, ICC. It set a precedent that governments and leaders could not justify mass killings as internal matters of state sovereignty. The inclusion of crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg trial was a monumental shift in international law. It ensured that, even in war, there are moral and legal boundaries that cannot be crossed. It also reinforced the idea that justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but also about recognizing the suffering of victims and ensuring that such crimes are never repeated. The Nuremberg trial was not the effort of a single nation. It was a collaborative endeavor by the 4 major Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. These nations, despite their differing political ideologies and legal systems, united to establish the International Military Tribunal, IMD, and prosecute the top Nazi leaders. The trial was a remarkable display of international cooperation, as it required the coordination of legal experts, judges, prosecutors, and military officials from multiple countries to ensure a fair and comprehensive judicial process. Formation of the International Military Tribunal. After the end of World War II, the Allies faced a crucial question: how should Nazi leaders be punished? Some leaders, including British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, initially favored summary executions, swift punishments without trial. However, others, particularly U.S. President Harry S. Truman and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, advocated for a formal legal process that would establish an undeniable historical record of Nazi atrocities. To ensure justice was served, the London Charter of the International Military Tribunal was signed on August 8, 1945, by the 4 Allied nations. This agreement established the legal framework for the Nuremberg Trial and defined the specific crimes under which the Nazi leaders would be prosecuted: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. Roles of the Allied powers in the trial. Each of the 4 Allied nations played a distinct role in conducting the trial. United States, the lead American prosecutor, Justice Robert H. Jackson, played a key role in shaping the trial's legal framework. He was a Supreme Court justice and delivered one of the most powerful opening statements, emphasizing that the trial was not an act of vengeance, but a necessary step to establish international law. The U.S. also provided a significant portion of the evidence, documents, and testimonies used in the trial. United Kingdom. British prosecutor Sir Hartley Shawcross focused on proving the Nazi conspiracy to wage aggressive war. The British legal team ensured that the trial maintained proper legal procedures and fairness, reinforcing the legitimacy of the proceedings. Soviet Union. The Soviets played a crucial role in securing key evidence, especially regarding the atrocities committed on the Eastern Front, including the massacre of millions of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war. However, their participation was also controversial because they sought to hold the Germans responsible for crimes that the Soviet Union itself had committed, such as the Katyn massacre, where thousands of Polish officers were executed. France. The French prosecutors focused on Nazi crimes committed in occupied France, including the deportation of Jews to concentration camps, the use of forced labor, and the destruction of French cities and villages. Their involvement underscored the European dimension of Nazi war crimes. Challenges of international collaboration. Despite their common goal of prosecuting Nazi leaders, the Allies had to overcome significant challenges in conducting the trial together. Legal differences. The 4 nations had vastly different legal traditions. The United States and the United Kingdom followed common law, which relies on precedents, cross-examinations, and jury trials. In contrast, France and the Soviet Union followed civil law, which is based on written legal codes and investigative judges. Reconciling these differences required careful negotiation. Political tensions. The trial took place as geopolitical tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were growing, eventually leading to the Cold War. There were disputes over evidence, sentencing, and political motives, particularly regarding Soviet efforts to portray themselves as victims while concealing their own war crimes. Ensuring a fair trial, some critics feared that the trial might become an act of victor's justice, where the winners of the war imposed their version of events. However, the Allies made a significant effort to provide the defendants with legal representation, access to documents, and the right to present their defense. Despite these challenges, the Allied powers successfully conducted the trial, ensuring that the most powerful Nazi leaders were held accountable for their crimes. The collaboration between these nations laid the foundation for future international courts, proving that even in times of great political and legal differences, justice could be pursued collectively. One of the defining features of the Nuremberg trial was the overwhelming amount of evidence presented against the Nazi leadership. Unlike previous conflicts where victors often punished the defeated without formal legal proceedings, the Nuremberg trial was meticulously built on documented proof, eyewitness testimonies, and physical evidence. The prosecution did not rely on hearsay or second-hand accounts. Instead, they used the Nazis' own records, captured documents, photographs, films, and survivor testimonies to prove the scale and intentionality of their crimes. Documentary evidence. The Nazis' own records. The Nazi regime was notorious for its bureaucratic precision, a trait that ultimately became its downfall in court. The Germans had meticulously documented their activities, including mass deportations, extermination orders, and even financial transactions related to forced labor and stolen Jewish property. These official documents became some of the most damning pieces of evidence. For example, the Wannsee Conference Protocol was introduced as evidence, revealing the Nazis' explicit plan for the final solution, the systematic genocide of the Jewish population. Documents signed by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler detailed orders for the mass deportation and execution of Jews, political prisoners, and other persecuted groups. The minutes from high-ranking Nazi meetings showed how leaders actively planned wars of aggression and discussed the legal justifications for their conquests. These records made it impossible for the defendants to claim they were unaware of the atrocities committed under their command. Eyewitness testimonies and survivor accounts. While documents provided undeniable proof of Nazi crimes, it was the human testimonies that gave the trial its emotional and historical weight. Survivors of concentration camps, former prisoners of war, and witnesses from occupied countries came forward to describe the horrors they endured. One of the most harrowing testimonies came from survivors of Auschwitz, Dachau, and Treblinka, who recounted the systematic extermination of Jews and other prisoners. Their descriptions of gas chambers, forced labor, starvation, and brutal medical experiments left the courtroom in stunned silence. Many judges, lawyers, and even members of the defense team were visibly shaken by their words. Former Nazi officers and soldiers also testified, often confirming that they had received direct orders from top Nazi leaders to commit mass executions. Some defendants, such as Adolf Eichmann, who was tried separately later in Israel, admitted to overseeing deportations but claimed they were only following orders. However, the extensive documentation and multiple testimonies proved that these were not isolated incidents, but part of a coordinated and deliberate policy of genocide. Visual evidence, photographs, and films. Perhaps the most powerful and indisputable evidence came in the form of photographs and film footage. The prosecution presented liberation footage from concentration camps, which showed the starved bodies of prisoners, mass graves, and the horrifying conditions in which millions had suffered and died. The film Nazi Concentration Camps, produced by the U.S. military, was screened during the trial. It contained footage of piles of corpses discovered at Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, emaciated survivors too weak to stand, gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz and Majdanek, torture devices and experimental labs used for inhumane medical experiments. The sheer horror captured in these images made it impossible for the defense to claim that these atrocities had been exaggerated or fabricated. Even some of the Nazi defendants appeared shaken when confronted with the undeniable proof of their crimes. Forensic and material evidence. In addition to documents, testimonies, and visual media, forensic evidence played a crucial role. Investigators conducted extensive examinations of mass graves, execution sites, and concentration camp facilities to verify the scale of the crimes. Autopsies confirmed that prisoners had been executed in mass shootings, subjected to medical torture, and gassed in chambers designed for large-scale extermination. Captured Nazi weapons, uniforms, and instruments of torture were displayed in court. Experts testified about the chemicals used in gas chambers, such as Zyklon B, and how it was deployed to kill thousands at a time. The physical evidence removed any doubt about the scale and industrialized efficiency of the Holocaust. The defense's reaction to the evidence. Faced with an overwhelming mountain of evidence, most of the defendants struggled to defend themselves. Some tried to distance themselves from the crimes by claiming they were only following orders or had no knowledge of what was happening. Others, such as Hermann Göring, attempted to justify Nazi policies, arguing that they were acting in Germany's best interests. However, the documentary evidence, eyewitness testimonies, and physical proof left little room for doubt. Several of the accused broke down or remained silent when confronted with undeniable evidence. Even Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, who had initially denied responsibility, admitted during the trial, "1,000 years will pass, and still this guilt of Germany will not have been erased." Impact of the evidence on the world. The extensive evidence presented at Nuremberg did more than just convict individual Nazis. It established a historical record of the Holocaust and Nazi war crimes that could not be denied or dismissed. The trial set the precedent that war crimes and crimes against humanity must be proven beyond doubt, using verifiable evidence. The use of such overwhelming documentation also ensured that Holocaust denial would never gain legitimacy. The thousands of pages of Nazi records, survivor testimonies, and undeniable photographic evidence made the reality of these crimes indisputable. Future war crimes tribunals, including those for the Rwandan genocide and the Yugoslav wars, would follow Nuremberg's model of evidence-based prosecution, ensuring that justice was served based on factual proof rather than political motivations. At the Nuremberg trial, the 24 high-ranking Nazi officials on trial displayed a wide range of reactions and defenses when confronted with the overwhelming evidence against them. Some remained defiant, attempting to justify their actions, while others denied responsibility or claimed ignorance. A few even expressed remorse, though whether their regret was genuine or an attempt to secure leniency remains debated. Their strategies reflected not just their individual personalities, but also the broader challenges of prosecuting crimes of such immense scale. Hermann Göring, the defiant leader. Hermann Göring, the most senior Nazi official on trial, remained defiant until his death. As Hitler's designated successor at one point and the head of the Luftwaffe, he had played a central role in Nazi war efforts and the Holocaust. However, rather than showing remorse, Göring mocked the trial and attempted to portray himself as a patriot. Göring insisted that Germany had the right to expand its territory, framing the war as a necessary struggle for national survival. He claimed that the persecution of Jews and other minorities was a state policy and that he had merely followed orders from Hitler. During cross-examinations, he verbally sparred with prosecutors, refusing to acknowledge the full extent of the Nazi atrocities. Despite his confidence, the overwhelming evidence against him made his guilt undeniable. Before his scheduled execution, Göring committed suicide by ingesting cyanide, ensuring he would not face the humiliation of the gallows. Rudolf Hess, the unstable loyalist. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, presented an entirely different reaction. Having flown to Scotland in 1941 on a bizarre, unauthorized peace mission, Hess was largely sidelined for the latter half of the war. During the trial, his behavior was erratic and unpredictable. He claimed amnesia, stating that he could not remember key events of the war. He occasionally laughed inappropriately during proceedings, leading some to speculate about his mental health. At times, he displayed extreme loyalty to Hitler, insisting that he still admired the Führer and regretted nothing. The tribunal ultimately found him guilty, but due to his perceived mental instability, he was sentenced to life imprisonment instead of death. He spent the rest of his life in Spandau prison, where he eventually died by suicide in 1987. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the weak-willed diplomat. As Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop was responsible for negotiating key alliances, including the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union. At Nuremberg, Ribbentrop was noticeably nervous and weak. The verdicts at the Nuremberg trial were as historic as the trial itself, with sentences that varied from death by hanging to life imprisonment and even acquittal. The tribunal had to weigh not only the gravity of each defendant's actions, but also their individual roles within the Nazi regime. This led to a range of punishments that sparked both approval and controversy, as some believed the sentences were too lenient while others saw them as fair and legally justified. The sentencing process. After nearly a year of hearings and deliberations, the judges, representing the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, handed down their verdicts on October 1, 1946. The sentences were based on 4 major charges: crimes against peace, planning and initiating aggressive wars; war crimes, violations of the laws of war, including mistreatment of prisoners and destruction of civilian populations; crimes against humanity, systematic persecution, genocide, and extermination. Conspiracy to commit these crimes, coordinating and executing these crimes through organized plans. Each defendant was judged based on their degree of involvement in these crimes, with evidence from documents, testimonies, and their own statements determining their fate. Death sentences. 12 of the 24 major defendants were sentenced to death by hanging for their direct roles in orchestrating Nazi crimes. Among them were Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, responsible for the Luftwaffe and early implementation of anti-Jewish policies. However, before he could be executed, Göring committed suicide in his cell using cyanide. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, who played a key role in diplomatic agreements that enabled the war. Wilhelm Keitel, head of the German armed forces, who signed numerous illegal orders, including those permitting the execution of Soviet prisoners of war. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a high-ranking SS officer deeply involved in the Gestapo and the concentration camp system. Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief racial theorist, whose ideology fueled genocide policies. Hans Frank, Governor-General of Nazi-occupied Poland, directly responsible for the Holocaust in that region. Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior, responsible for enacting many anti-Semitic laws. Julius Streicher, publisher of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, which spread Nazi propaganda and incited hatred against Jews. Fritz Sauckel, chief organizer of Nazi slave labor programs, forcing millions to work under brutal conditions. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, Nazi leader in Austria and later in occupied Netherlands, where he oversaw mass deportations to concentration camps. The executions were carried out on October 16, 1946 at the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, except for Göring, who had taken his own life just hours before. The hangings were deliberately not publicized to avoid turning the executed Nazis into martyrs. Life and long-term imprisonments. Not all defendants received death sentences. Some were given life in prison or long-term sentences, as the tribunal determined they were less directly involved in war crimes or genocide, despite their senior positions. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, sentenced to life imprisonment due to his high-ranking role, even though he had been sidelined in 1941. He served his sentence in Spandau prison, where he died in 1987. Walther Funk, Nazi Minister of Economics, sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in the plundering of occupied territories and involvement in forced labor. Erich Raeder, Grand Admiral of the German Navy, sentenced to life imprisonment for leading naval warfare strategies that violated international laws. Karl Donitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet and briefly Hitler's successor as Germany's leader, sentenced to 10 years in prison for unrestricted submarine warfare. Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, sentenced to 20 years in prison for indoctrinating German youth with Nazi ideology. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and Minister of Armaments, sentenced to 20 years in prison for using forced labor but avoiding direct involvement in mass killings. Acquittals and controversy. 3 of the defendants were acquitted, sparking controversy as many believed they had played significant roles in the Nazi system. These included Hans Fritsch, a radio broadcaster and Nazi propagandist, acquitted because his speeches, though inflammatory, were not deemed criminal acts under the tribunal's definitions. Franz von Papen, a former German chancellor and Nazi diplomat, acquitted due to lack of direct involvement in war crimes. Hjalmar Schacht, a Nazi economic planner, acquitted on the grounds that his actions were not considered direct crimes against humanity. The acquittals were met with mixed reactions, particularly from Holocaust survivors and nations that had suffered under Nazi rule. Many feared that these verdicts signaled that some high-ranking officials had escaped justice. Aftermath of the sentencing. The sentences handed down at Nuremberg set a global precedent for how war criminals would be tried in the future. Some viewed the sentences as too lenient, while others believed they were fair given the legal standards at the time. The trial demonstrated that even the most powerful leaders could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. The execution of Nazi officials and the long prison sentences imposed on others served as a warning to future dictators and war criminals that international justice would not be blind to their actions. However, the Nuremberg trial was just the beginning. Subsequent war crimes tribunals, including those for the Yugoslav wars, the Rwandan genocide, and more recently, crimes committed in conflicts worldwide, would be shaped by the precedents set at Nuremberg. The Nuremberg trial was not just a moment of justice for the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. It became a blueprint for future war crimes tribunals, shaping international law and establishing legal principles that continue to influence global justice today. For the first time in history, leaders of a nation were held personally responsible for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. This precedent changed the way the world viewed war, accountability, and human rights. The legal innovations of Nuremberg. Before Nuremberg, war criminals were rarely prosecuted in a formal judicial setting. After World War I, for example, there were some attempts to prosecute German leaders, but these efforts largely failed due to political disagreements and weak legal frameworks. The Nuremberg trial broke new ground by establishing key legal concepts that had never been used before in an international court. The crimes against humanity. One of the most important legacies of Nuremberg was the recognition that governments could be held accountable for crimes committed against their own people. Previously, mass killings or persecution within a country's own borders were considered internal matters. Nuremberg rejected this notion, declaring that genocide, enslavement, and systematic persecution were crimes under international law, regardless of whether they occurred in times of war or peace. Crimes against peace. Another major legal innovation was holding individuals accountable for aggressive war itself. Before Nuremberg, wars of conquest were often seen as unfortunate but not illegal. However, the tribunal ruled that planning and waging a war of aggression was a crime, meaning leaders could no longer justify war simply as political or military necessities. Command responsibility. The trial also introduced the principle that military and political leaders could not escape responsibility by claiming they were just following orders. This was a direct rejection of the defense used by many Nazi officers, who argued that they were merely obeying Hitler's commands. The court ruled that leaders had a duty to refuse illegal orders and could be held accountable if they carried out atrocities, even under pressure. Conspiracy to commit war crimes. For the first time, the tribunal made it clear that even planning or participating in a conspiracy to commit war crimes was punishable, even if the individual did not personally kill or harm anyone. This principle later became critical in prosecuting war criminals who may not have been on the battlefield but were instrumental in organizing genocide and war crimes from behind the scenes. Influence on later war crimes tribunals. The legal principles established at Nuremberg became the foundation for subsequent war crimes trials. Over the following decades, the world saw new international tribunals that followed the Nuremberg model, including the Tokyo Trials, 1946 to 1948, held in Japan after World War II. This trial prosecuted high-ranking Japanese officials for war crimes, including the rape of Nanking and biological warfare experiments. The structure of the trial was almost identical to Nuremberg, with judges from allied nations, multiple charges, and the principle of command responsibility applied. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, 1993 to 2017. This court was established to prosecute individuals responsible for genocide, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. It convicted leaders such as Slobodan Milosevic, Ratko Mladic, and Radovan Karadzic for crimes committed in Bosnia, Croatia, and Kosovo. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, 1994 to 2015, created in response to the 1994 Rwandan genocide, in which nearly 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed in just 100 days. The ICTR used Nuremberg's legal framework to prosecute those responsible, including government officials, military leaders, and propagandists who incited mass killings. The International Criminal Court, ICC, 2002 present. Perhaps the most significant result of Nuremberg's legal influence was the creation of the ICC, a permanent court established to prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Unlike previous tribunals, which were temporary and focused on specific conflicts, the ICC has global jurisdiction, allowing it to prosecute individuals regardless of nationality or political position. Challenges and controversies in applying Nuremberg's principles. While the Nuremberg Trials set an important precedent, applying its principles in later conflicts has not always been easy. Some challenges include selective justice. Critics argue that only the defeated nations have been prosecuted under Nuremberg's legal framework. For example, Allied war crimes during World War II, such as the bombing of civilian populations in Dresden and Hiroshima, were not prosecuted. Similarly, leaders of powerful nations have often escaped prosecution, leading to accusations of victors' justice. Enforcement issues. While Nuremberg established that war criminals should be held accountable, the reality is that many perpetrators of atrocities still evade justice. Dictators and war criminals often flee to safe countries, manipulate legal systems, or enjoy political protection, making it difficult to bring them to trial. Political influence. Some war crimes tribunals have been criticized for being influenced by political agendas. For example, some argue that certain cases brought before the ICC have targeted leaders from weaker nations while avoiding prosecution of individuals from powerful countries. Nuremberg's legacy in modern human rights law. Despite these challenges, the impact of the Nuremberg trial is undeniable. It not only laid the groundwork for modern war crimes prosecution but also helped shape international human rights law in broader ways. The Genocide Convention, 1948. Inspired by Nuremberg, the United Nations officially defined genocide as an international crime, making it illegal under international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. This landmark document, which set global standards for human rights, was heavily influenced by the atrocities exposed during the Nuremberg trial. The Geneva Conventions, 1949, new rules on the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war were established, directly addressing many of the war crimes prosecuted at Nuremberg. Nuremberg's greatest achievement was proving that even heads of state and military leaders are not above the law. It set the foundation for a world where war crimes and crimes against humanity would no longer be tolerated without legal consequences. The trial paved the way for future accountability, ensuring that those who commit atrocities cannot simply hide behind the excuse of war or political power. The Nuremberg trial established one of the most groundbreaking principles in legal history. No leader, no matter how powerful, is above the law. Before Nuremberg, political and military leaders often operated under the assumption that they could wage war, commit atrocities, and oppress their own people without facing personal consequences. The trial shattered this notion, proving that those who plan, orchestrate, and execute crimes against humanity would be held personally responsible, regardless of their rank or position. This principle was revolutionary because, throughout history, leaders and military commanders were rarely punished for their crimes. Even when wars ended, defeated rulers often went into exile rather than facing trial. Nuremberg challenged this tradition by ensuring that Nazi officials, who once held absolute power over millions, were subjected to the same legal scrutiny as ordinary criminals. This precedent has had profound and lasting effects on international law, influencing how war criminals and dictators are held accountable even today. The superior orders defense was rejected. One of the most common defenses used by the Nazi officials on trial was the claim that they were merely following orders from Hitler. They argued that as military officers and government officials, they had no choice but to obey commands, even if those commands led to mass murder, genocide, and war crimes. This defense, often referred to as superior orders, had historically been used to excuse individuals from responsibility in cases where they acted under higher authority. However, the Nuremberg judges firmly rejected this argument. The tribunal ruled that following orders does not absolve a person from responsibility if those orders involve crimes against humanity. This principle meant that every individual, regardless of their position, has a moral and legal duty to resist illegal and inhumane commands. The rejection of the superior orders defense became one of the most important legal precedents in modern history, shaping future war crimes trials and influencing military laws worldwide. Accountability extended beyond political and military leaders. Another major outcome of the Nuremberg trial was that accountability was not limited to just political leaders or top generals. The trial prosecuted individuals from a variety of backgrounds, demonstrating that anyone who played a role in enabling atrocities could be held responsible. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, was convicted for his role in negotiating treaties that led to war and genocide. Julius Streicher, a newspaper publisher, was sentenced to death for spreading anti-Semitic propaganda that fueled the Holocaust. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect, was imprisoned for using forced labor to build weapons and infrastructure for the Nazi war machine. This expansion of responsibility was significant because it meant that crimes against humanity were not just committed by those who physically carried them out, they were also made possible by those who planned, financed, justified, or enabled them. This principle has influenced modern trials, ensuring that individuals who promote hate speech, facilitate genocide, or finance war crimes can also be prosecuted. The principle applied to future dictators and war criminals. The idea that leaders could be held accountable did not end with Nuremberg. In the decades that followed, this precedent was used to prosecute other dictators, military leaders, and political figures responsible for atrocities. Some of the most notable cases influenced by Nuremberg include Slobodan Milosevic, Serbia. The former Yugoslav leader was put on trial for war crimes and genocide during the 1990s Balkans conflict. He became the first sitting head of state to be prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Saddam Hussein, Iraq. The Iraqi dictator was captured and tried for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide against Kurdish populations. His trial followed many of the legal principles established at Nuremberg. Charles Taylor, Liberia. The former Liberian president was convicted of war crimes for his role in fueling the civil war in Sierra Leone and enabling mass atrocities. Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, Bosnia. These Bosnian Serb leaders were prosecuted for their roles in the Srebrenica massacre and ethnic cleansing campaigns. These cases demonstrated that no matter how powerful a leader is, they can be brought to justice. The world had seen how Nazi officials were made to answer for their crimes at Nuremberg, and this set a clear example. If leaders commit genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity, they will be pursued, captured, and tried, no matter how long it takes. The challenge of enforcing this principle globally. Despite Nuremberg's precedent, enforcing leader accountability remains a global challenge. Many world leaders accused of war crimes continue to evade justice due to political protection, lack of international cooperation, or weak legal mechanisms. Some of the obstacles include political influence. Some powerful nations shield their allies from prosecution, making it difficult to hold certain leaders accountable. Lack of enforcement mechanisms. The International Criminal Court, ICC, can issue arrest warrants, but it depends on individual countries to carry them out. Some nations refuse to extradite or arrest their own officials. Selective justice. Critics argue that international justice is applied unevenly, with leaders from smaller nations more likely to be prosecuted than those from powerful countries. Despite these challenges, the principle of leader accountability remains one of Nuremberg's most significant legacies.